This is a 400 level session on Microsoft Flow. How many people in the room have never heard of anything about Microsoft Flow before? OK, so it looks like maybe one person over there. Since this is a 400 level session, I'm going to assume that you have some background of Microsoft Flow. I'm going to do a quick introduction, just so that way everybody's on the same page. But I'm going to do a pretty deep dive into some of the most advanced capabilities that Microsoft Flow has. So hopefully you already have some context and you're already in kind of the mind space of what Microsoft Flow is like. So if you don't have any experience yet, or this kind of goes over your head, feel free to walk out. I won't be offended. You also, of course, all of these sessions are recorded and posted online. So there will definitely be some slides that are kind of like reference material. You can come back to those afterwards, get through the links and all those things. So without further ado, the goal of this session is to really understand those most advanced capabilities that Flow has. And I'm going to show building flows. I'm going to spend a lot of time writing expressions inside Microsoft Flow. That's kind of one of the most interesting untapped areas. I don't think we've really gone into expressions in a conference before, so I'll show you that. We just announced on Friday that we have IntelliSense for expressions, so you'll be able to see that a little bit. As you go, it's actually not very exciting. It just feels very natural, which I guess is what we're trying to do. So yeah, and that's my hope for this session, is you really get a sense of more of what's possible. I do not want you or expect you to memorize the list of expressions that I show on screen. That would be a very bad idea. Instead, just think of this kind of as reference material to get a taste of what's possible and what you can do with the product. So just a quick introduction. With Microsoft Flow, we consider ourselves to be part of what we call the business application platform. So Microsoft Flow and Microsoft Power Apps in particular, those two products work really well together to enable business applications and business workflows to be created very quickly. And our target audience for Microsoft Flow is power users. So you're going to see a lot of almost coding things in this session today, in the same sense that when you go to Excel and you do a VLOOKUP, that might feel a little bit like coding as well. So we won't have any C# code here. We're not going to be doing any .NET. We're never going to see Visual Studio in this session. That's because Microsoft Flow is really targeted at those power users, the people who are a bit more comfortable maybe with expressions, formulas, those types of things, doing pivot tables in Excel. That type of person is our target audience for Microsoft Flow, in particular for the types of features you'll see here today. And if you caught the session earlier in the day from Anjali with the introduction, you may be familiar that Microsoft Flow can do a lot of very simple things for novice users as well. So don't think that this is the only way you can use Flow. You can use Flow to do simple automation, but today I'm going to be going pretty much right into some of those more advanced capabilities. And just to keep in mind, we also build this business application platform on top of Microsoft Azure. And there's a bunch of rich pro developer capabilities that are above and beyond what you can do with Flow. So I will actually show a little bit of the Azure portal at the end. We have some cool integrations with Azure Logic Apps that I'll give you a short view into. But keep in mind that this layer, this is not where it stops. We don't want to have cliffs in our platform. As you build a flow and you get more and more rich and you say, hey, now it's time to take this into Visual Studio, you can do that by building on top of the pro developer platform we have in Azure. And finally, the connectors and the common data service are the way that we connect to data and use data from inside of both the Logic Apps and the Flow. So between these two different platforms that are kind of brought together, they use the same underlying infrastructure, which does enable that seamless grow-up story that I was talking about. So if you've heard of Flow and you've used a little bit of Flow, hopefully these next couple of slides are repeat information. But the idea that I want to get across is there is triggers at the beginning of the flow and actions throughout the flow. So a trigger, you can have a variety of different ways to trigger a flow. The most common ones you've probably heard about already is I can run on a schedule. I can trigger a flow manually. But there's actually many different ways you can even use these individual permutations. We just announced last week that you can create advanced schedules inside Microsoft Flow. So you can say, hey, I want to run every day. But you also can say, I want to run on 4 a.m. on Saturdays. I want to run every other hour, but not on weekends. Those types of conditions you can actually build into recurrences now. So triggers although you may have been familiar with kind of the simple variants, we're getting much more powerful there as well. And of course, triggers can, this is the most common way to do it, be built on top of cloud events or events that run in an on-premise system. And with regards to on-premises, we actually just announced that you can now build custom connectors that connect to your own line of business APIs on premises as well. So you can even trigger flows that are based on events that happen inside of your data center. Then, of course, actions are the steps. Those are the things that the flow actually does. A trigger alone does nothing, right? You want to do something with your flow. If you're not doing anything, then why bother creating a flow? So with the actions, you can connect, of course, to the wide variety of connectors we have in the Common Data Service. You also can use actions to connect directly to an HTTP endpoint. If you have an API out there that you want to be able to call, you can actually construct that request directly inside the Flow UI. That really gives you a great escape hatch if there's something that you can't really very easily model inside of a connector and you don't want to create that connector. You can call out pretty much to any API. And we also just announced that you can use this HTTP action, this direct HTTP action, with Azure Active Directory OAuth connections, which means if you have, for example, APIs in Graph that we haven't created a connector to yet, you can actually now call those by using the direct HTTP capability inside of Microsoft Flow. The other thing to keep in mind is we actually have a bunch of actions that don't actually connect to anything. There's what we call the data operations. You may have seen them. You may have played with them a little bit. I'll talk a lot more about those. But the data operations are how you can manipulate data when it's inside of a single flow. If you want to transform between one shape of data to another shape of data, you can use the data operations that we have. So you may be wondering, probably not actually, where did the name flow come from? Well, we like to talk about flowing data inside of our flows, just to sound a bit redundant. So inside of a flow, the data flows from step to step to step. And if I have a trigger, say, at the trigger time, it will output a certain number of parameters. Those outputs can then be used throughout the entire rest of the flow. So you don't have to build state yourself. It will actually accumulate as the flow proceeds. So if I add an action in here, the inputs to that first action can use any of the data that the trigger originally returned. And likewise, if that action itself outputs some data and I add a second action in, it can use all of the data from the first action as well as from the trigger. And you can imagine, as you go along, you can use more and more of the data. So you can go out, query to a database, retrieve information, use that, and continue. So the way to get this data into your flow is we have this blue button at the bottom of every text box called Add Dynamic Content. And I'll show you exactly how that works. But that is your entry point into basically everything that you need to do inside Flow, besides just typing in some value directly. The other thing to keep in mind is that some inputs may or may not show depending on the data type. So we don't expose this necessarily as clearly in the UI as maybe we should. But Microsoft Flow is based on a few fundamental data types, which I'll talk about in a minute. But when you use dynamic content from one step, you may notice, hey, where are all the fields? I clicked on this field, and I saw a bunch of things, and I clicked on this next field, and I only saw one or two. And that's because we filter to make sure that you're using the appropriate data type in a given input based on the data type of the output. So let's talk a little bit more about data types and expressions and how they work together. So expressions are how you can manipulate information throughout your flow. You can create a dedicated step that does an expression, and you can also use expressions inline in all of the actions. If you haven't used Flow in a few months, this may seem completely new to you because we actually just released it a few months ago. The expression language that we have is based on it is the exact same expression language that Azure Logic Apps has as well. So it's a common language used between both the platform targeting power users as well as targeting pro developers. There's a bunch of things you can do with expressions. You can convert between different types of data. So as I mentioned, we filter the outputs and inputs based on types. But you can explicitly convert them as well to use them appropriately. You can, of course, do simple inline calculations. If you just want to add some numbers together, do some division, do some subtraction, all of those things you can do. Another very common operation is to use data operations to manipulate date and time. You can generate new data with expressions. If I want to get a unique identifier, or a GUID, or I want to get the current time, and I want to be able to use that in a flow, we have expressions for those. You can use it to handle optional values. I'll definitely dive into this a little bit more, but optional values are one of the things that people get tripped up by the most, because not all properties are always available in a flow. If you have a SharePoint list that has some columns that are optional, and you try to use those columns downstream in a flow, and you don't handle that optional value properly, that flow may fail. That's definitely a very common error pattern, and I will talk about how to handle that. You can use conditions to drive logic into your flows if you want to be able to go down one branch or go down another branch depending on some value. Expressions are incredibly valuable there because you can use things like ands and ors and nots. You can create however advanced of an expression you need to be able to run the Boolean logic that determines whether or not flow goes down one branch or another. And finally, expressions are particularly useful as well for dealing with lists. Lists can definitely require some amount of manipulation to be able to get them to behave properly inside of a flow, and I'll show you demos of that. So if you haven't used flow in the last couple of months, I can show real quick how you add expressions. So again, you have that same entry point called add dynamic content, and that shows up on pretty much every single input box inside of the flow experience. And when you bring that up, you get a flyout that has two tabs. So dynamic content, that's what we've had since the beginning, where it's just a list of all of the outputs of the previous steps. And you can just click on one of those outputs, and it will put that value into your flow. But there's a new tab called expression. And on that tab, you now get a formula bar where you can type whatever expression you want in. You click OK, and it will drop that expression directly onto your action. And if you ever want to come back and edit that expression, just click that function token right there, and it will open that up again, and you can continue to edit it. So it's not like you have to go one way. So let's break down exactly what an expression looks like. And if you've used formulas in Excel, this should be familiar. It isn't exactly the same, but it is very similar. So let's say what I'm trying to do is at the top there, I have an object with three properties. It has an ID, a title, and a name. And I want to replace the string time. That literally inside it, it has the carets and the word time. But I want that to actually instead have the current time. I want that to take what's on the left and make it on the right. So I'm going to use the replace expression for this. It's a pretty straightforward expression. So first, you need to type the expression name and make sure that you have parentheses on both sides to match. Then you need to understand how many parameters or arguments that expression has. So for replace, there are actually three arguments. First is the text that you're searching through. The second argument is what you are trying to find in that text. And the final argument is what you're going to replace the text that you're found with. So it's just like find and replace inside of Word, right? So you separate those commas. Then some arguments you can pass in directly. So in this case, what I'm looking for is the literal string time with the brackets on both sides. And when you are inputting text directly into an expression, you need to use the single quote character in order to designate that that is text that you're putting in directly. So with that, that's how you can imagine you can put a space there, or if you put a comma inside that string, you need some way to make sure that you know that that's part of that actual string. So use those single quote characters. If you're familiar with Excel, normally what you actually use there would be double quote characters, but there are some differences between Excel and Flow, like I mentioned. Now, you can, of course, include other expressions inside of this expression. So in this case, I've actually done that twice. On the right-hand side, I have an expression called UTC now, and that just grabs the current timestamp. And on the left, I'm using an expression called body. And we have a few important expressions that are used for retrieving the outputs from previous actions. And in this case, the action was called getRecord, and I went, and from the body of getRecord, I'm going to grab a property called myTitle. So this, using the square brackets, is how you can get at that property and then use that inside of the expression. So in this case, this is saying, hey, I'm going to take the title from the body of the getRecord action, and I'm going to find the string time in it, and then I'm going to replace that with the actual current time when this flow runs. Finally, there's a question mark in there. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but it has to do with how you handle optional properties. So I've talked about these data types. What are all the data types that we have inside Microsoft Flow? we try to classify them into two buckets. The first bucket is what we call the textual data types, the strings. And there are different types of strings depending on how they're encoded. And encoding is important because different protocols, imagine email versus REST versus SOAP, they may encode content differently. So although we do a pretty good job of abstracting this away from the novice user of Microsoft Flow, under the covers, there are these different types of strings. So when you do a content conversion, you may need to be aware of that. Then on the right-hand side, there's some of those more familiar types that, if you've done any type of programming or even working with Excel, you may be familiar with things like a floating point number, so a number with a decimal, integers, which are whole numbers, booleans, which can be true or false. And then we have the complex types, the compound types, things like arrays, which is a list of items, and objects, which is a dictionary of items. Objects in particular are very common inside of Microsoft Flow, so you do need to be somewhat familiar with how you can work with those, and I'll definitely talk through that as well. One final note is that the way that you represent a value inside of an expression can change its type. So if I type with the single ticks, TRUE, what that means is that means the string true. It's a series of letters. That is different from typing directly TRUE, because that's a Boolean, which means yes, it means true. So just like you may be familiar with in Excel or other programming languages, you do have to be cognizant of whether or not you're working with a string or a Boolean or an integer. And of course, we'll see some examples of that. So we have a bunch of expressions that can be used for converting between different types. And like I said, please don't try to memorize this list. But conversion is often automatic. We try inside of the Flow UI to make sure that when you use one value in a field, that the referencing of that is done to do whatever conversion we can. But sometimes we can't do conversion. And please do not try to memorize this chart either. But this is just some reference, gets you a sense of what's going on here. On one column, we have all of the types. And then along the top, we have all the types as well. And you can see what's going on here is the green squares. Those are things that we can convert automatically. So a bunch of different types we convert automatically. The yellow squares, those are things that you'll have to add an explicit expression in about. The red squares are things that are impossible. So there is no way to convert a Boolean to a floating point number, for example, or vice versa. So those aren't possible. But this is just to give you a sense that we try to do a lot automatically, but in some cases, you may need to write an expression that does an explicit type conversion. Finally, there's those orange boxes at the bottom. Sometimes you can't use an expression. You need actually to use an action to convert between types. So this comes into play if you have an array and you want to be able to convert it to a different looking array. You need to use an action called select or compose, which I will definitely demo. OK, so that's all about data types. Hopefully, I won't have to talk about that much again. Now, some other things you can do with expressions are working with strings. This is a very common pattern where I just want to combine two strings together, replace, like we just talked about with the previous example you can do with strings. You can take substrings, right, parts of strings out. All of these are possible, and there's a bunch of expressions for that. So that's useful. Likewise, you can do arithmetic. Now, unlike Excel, we do not support the ability to type arithmetic operators directly into the expression experience. So if you want to do a plus b, you can't actually type a plus b today. And that is a limitation of the expression language that we have. So instead, what you have to do is you have to type add a and b. Or in this case, which is slightly more complicated, I want to take x plus y times z. So we have an expression called add. We have an expression called multiply. So you have to multiply y and z together, and then you add that to x. One small advantage of this is it is much more explicit in terms of order of operations. Hopefully, everybody remembers from their algebra classes that that's the order of operations, not the other way around. But this is one of the limitations that we have in Flow. So keep in mind, if you're trying to add numbers together, don't expect to just hit a plus and have it add. Date and times, as I mentioned, another very common thing that you can do with Flow. A bunch of functions here for interacting with date and times. People often need to be able to add times together. If you're generating a prettily formatted email, you want to be able to convert the time to the local time of whoever's receiving that email. So we have a function for that, for formatting it in a way that's very easily displayed. So that's another set there. And expressions in conditions. So this is where we're talking about those Boolean expressions that I talked about, where we have the ability to say two expressions ANDed together. I want to check to see if it's been approved by the manager and been approved by the manager's manager. I want to be able to see if either person A, B, or C approved something. You can do that by using these and or expressions. We, of course, have a not expression, and the comparison expressions like equals, greater than, less than or equals, etc. Now, to get expressions inside of a condition, it is slightly different from the way that you get expressions into a normal action. You select Edit in Advance mode on the condition step, and that will give you a text box that you can type directly in. Unfortunately, we don't yet have IntelliSense enabled for that experience, so I'm not actually going to demo it. But for the other experiences, we have IntelliSense, and we will bring IntelliSense to this experience as well. There's another way to do conditional logic inside Flow that people may be less familiar with. So, if you've used Flow, you've definitely seen maybe flows like this with a bunch of nested boxes, and it can be very unwieldy. And sure, you can collapse these things, but it's definitely not very pleasant to work with. So we do have an expression called if. And if you're familiar with programming languages, this is kind of like a ternary operator, where you can say just inline, evaluate some condition, and then comma, the value that you want to use if that condition is true, and comma, the value you want to use if that condition is false. So it's a very simple way, without adding any additional steps or conditions or really any logic at all, to be able to populate an action based on some condition that you want to write. So I'll show you a very clear example of why this can be very useful in a moment. Now, keep in mind, this can only determine whether or not some input in the field is defined. If you want to run two different actions, depending on a condition, then obviously you still need to use conditions as you're probably familiar with today. Finally, expressions are important for handling optional values. And that is valuable because not all fields will be there all the time. So that's where that question mark character that I was talking about comes in. It's a character that indicates it's OK for that property to not exist. And then you have to use an expression called coalesce to take the value and check to see if it's null, if it's not present, if it's blank, not set. There's a bunch of different terminology for what that means if it's not there. But basically, it checks to see if that value isn't there. And if it isn't, it will use the default value that you pass as the second argument. So this is how you can handle a case where somebody doesn't fill out all of the fields in your form. And you need to be able to handle those fields not being present, is using the coalesce function. OK, so I've talked enough. Now let's switch back to, or switch for the first time, I guess, to my screen here. And I'm going to type my password before I switch. OK, so all the demos today are going to be based off of this simple SharePoint list. And it may be deceivingly simple, because what I'm going to want to do today is to create some robust notifications on top of this list. And you may be asking yourself, what's so hard about making notifications on this list? Well, unfortunately, the person who set up this list didn't give me rights to add and remove columns. And there's some weird semantics going on here. So the first thing is the end time field is required, but the start time is optional. So sometimes people aren't filling out the start time. The other thing is here, this is a column that has comma-separated email aliases. So it's just the first part of the email, not the domain. And there's this column called number of days where people kind of have to think to themselves how many days this project is going to take. But you could actually calculate that based on the start time and end time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a flow that can automate both making sure that the columns of this list are updated so that way the end time and the start time are summing so that way they're the right number of days. And it will send out notifications to all of the people in that email aliases column, even though they're not full email addresses, and I need to do some manipulation on them. OK, so when you're coming in SharePoint here, you may notice that there's a flow button. Hopefully you've seen this before, and I can just say create a flow. That brings up a list of a bunch of different templates that you can create from a SharePoint list. And I'm going to just do a custom action because this is an advanced demo and I don't want to do something too simple. And once this loads, you can see, hopefully you've seen this type of thing before. It picked my connection up. I'm authorized successfully, so I can continue directly into the full designer. And this first trigger is populated when a new item is created in a SharePoint list. And now let's go ahead and add a step. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that those columns that were not necessarily populated are going to contain the right values. So I'm going to update the item. And of course, I want to update this item in the same SharePoint list. You know, one of the powerful things about Microsoft Flow is you can, of course, work across different SharePoint sites and different SharePoint farms. But in this case, I'm just going to do everything in one. And now I've adding dynamic content into the ID field of this thus update item action. Now, this is an example of how the data types filter depending on the field you have selected. So ID, this is a number field. Title is a string. You see how there's a completely different set of inputs and outputs available. But the ID is still here. And that's because we can convert a number automatically to a string. We just can't necessarily do the opposite automatically, because you may not actually have a number in that string. So in the ID field, I'm going to use the ID of the item. And I don't need to change the title or the end time, because that's the required one. And finally, I'm not going to update the aliases either. So I can just drop those in. OK, so now what I want to do is I want to populate the start time. But I want to use that coalesce function that I was just talking about, because the start time might not be present. And I want to provide a default value to use instead. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to come over to this expression tab on the Add Dynamic Content. And you can see here I get a nice long list of a bunch of different expressions that we have. I also can just start typing, and I get IntelliSense right inside of the expression designer as well. So at this point, I can just hit Tab, and it will select the first item in that list. And now I can open this up. And again, just like IntelliSense would in Excel or Power Apps, I get the parameters that are being passed. So for coalescing, I'm going to take the start time field, because that's my optional field that I want to check. And then I'm going to put UTC now, because I just want, if somebody didn't provide a start time, I'm going to assume that the project just starts now. The other thing I want to do is I want to calculate the number of days that this project is going to take. And this is going to require a little more math. Because these times are stored as strings, I first need to find a way to convert the strings into a number that I can do math on top of. So I'm going to want to subtract these two dates. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a function called ticks. And what ticks does is that takes the string and converts it to 100 nanosecond intervals since January 1st, 1601. I don't know why any of that is the way it is, but it converts it to a number, and that's what I need. So I'm going to take the end time, and I'm going to subtract the start time. Now, if you may recall, the start time is optional, so I need to coalesce again in order to be able to get the start time properly there. So now I can select start time, just down here, UTC now. And OK, so I subtract. And let's see if those number of parentheses match. They did. We have validation in here. So if you try to drop an expression in that's invalid, we'll actually show you. So you don't have to wait for your flow to run before you find out that you typed something incorrectly. So here we go. So drop that in. Oh. OK, so now what I've done is I've subtracted these two dates. But if you recall, there's still something not quite right, because what this will return is it will return the difference in hundreds of nanoseconds between those two dates. So I need to do one more piece of math. I need to divide this number by the number of ticks that are in a day, because I want this to be in units of days. So you see, again, I'm getting this nice IntelliSense. I can come to the end here, and I've already calculated the number of seconds, or hundreds of nanoseconds in a day. So I won't type that here, but I can put that in. And there we go. Notice how I clicked on the expression in order to update it, and I was able to just come back here, continue editing it. So you can always edit these expressions once you've input them. If you have been in Flow for a very long time, you may recall that that wasn't always actually the case, but now you can. OK, so now I've made sure that the data inside my SharePoint list is formatted properly. The other thing I want to do is, of course, send out that email. So the first thing I'm going to add is I'm going to add a delay step, just so that way I don't send out the email immediately, but I'll send out the email 2 days before the project is done. And this is where I can use some other date-time math. So I can add an expression in here that I'm just going to subtract from the time that the project is going to be completed. So I'm going to come in here and select the end time, the letter E. And the interval, I'm just going to say 2 days. And there we go. So notice when I put in a number, in this case the number 2, I did not use the single quotes around the number. That's because you use the single quotes around strings, around textual things. But if you have a Boolean, or you have an integer, or you have a floating point number, those you type directly in without the single quote. So if I did this would actually fail, because that's not an integer, whereas this is. So now I am basically saying, hey, 2 days before the end time, the flow is going to pause and wait. And then I'm going to send an email, if I can click properly. So send email. And I'll just use Office 365 Outlook. We have a bunch of different email providers. But I'll send the email to the person who created that item. I'm going to say your project, and I can drop in the title here, is due in 2 days. Check it out. And you can use, for example, a link to that item. We have some fields that we populate inside of Flow, even though they're not necessarily columns in the SharePoint list. So I can put a link right there. And I'm just going to say the specific time that this task is due. So I'll say it's due at. And now, one other thing to keep in mind with dates and times is when services return a date and time, they always use universal time. They use UTC, because that's basically the lingua franca. That's the way that you make sure that time is always in the same place. Because depending on daylight savings, it can mess up, right? But we do have formulas you can use to convert from UTC to a local time. Because if I get this email, I don't want it to just say some UTC time, and then I have to do some calculation depending on what time zone I'm in, et cetera. So I can say convert from UTC. I can pick that same field that I had earlier, the end time. And I can have a destination time zone, in this case, Pacific Standard Time. And finally, I can also customize the format of the date as it shows up. I don't want necessarily the full format. I just want month, day, hour, and minute. So I can add that in and create the flow. So now what will happen is when an item is added to that SharePoint list, it will update the item automatically with the number of days between those two columns. So it does some math there. It then does some more math to calculate how long until they send the email out. Then it sends the email and sends it in local time for the user. Now, there's one other thing I want to show, which is the ability to use an if inside of an action. So I've already gone and I've constructed this email. I've put an expression in. And there's a scenario, though, that I want to warn users about. Because theoretically, I could put a start time after an end time, because I never put that validation into the SharePoint list. And I don't want to reject the project, because it was probably a mistake. So instead, what I'll do is I'll just warn the user in the email that, hey, your start time is after your end time. And I can use an if expression to do that without having to rebuild the rest of the email. I don't have to put a condition here. I can just say if, and then I can say greater or equals the start time and the end time. So this compares those two times together. And if the start time is greater than, if it's after the end time, then I will just put some warning in right here saying, warning, you input the data wrong. And there we go. So let me just make sure I got this right. The other thing, I messed up a little bit here. So I don't want the start time that's output from the trigger, because that could be null. I actually want the start time that's been output from the update item. So I'll select that. There we go. OK, so now my flow's been created. And if I did everything right perfectly, I should be able to come to this SharePoint list, add a new item. So I'll say, this is the Ignite demo project. I can select only an end time. So I'll say that my demo will be done tomorrow at 1 a.m. I can put in an email alias there and hit save. And this should go and run the flow. So if I come back here, you see it's already picked up that the flow ran. And it looks like I actually made a mistake. So let's see what I did.
You need to add another ticks in the subtract.
Sorry, what was that?
Start time you added a ticks, in end time you did not add ticks.
OK, great. So it looks like the template language requires it to be an integer or a decimal number, not a string. So I can go back and edit that. Or I can just fast forward because I've already built all of these flows. So I'll cheat a little bit. And let's see this automatic notification email flow that successfully worked, rather than me trying to go back into that expression. And you can see here, when an item is created, it sends an email and updates that item. OK, so I will now move on to working with arrays. So when working with arrays, first you need to understand what an array is and what it contains. So with an array, the simplest type of array is an array that has a list of strings. So I just want a list of names, for example. And in that list of names, you can have as many or as few. It could be an empty array. It could have only one name in it, or it can have a bunch of names in it. Next, I can have a list of numbers or Booleans or really any type of that very simple type. But one of the most common things you'll actually interact with in Flow is an array of objects. These objects are key value pairs, right? So in this case, this object is a user record. The user has an ID, it has a name, it has an email address. And I'll need to be able to do something on top of this user record. Maybe I want to send an email to each of these users. In that case, I'll need to manipulate this array to turn it into an email list that I'll send. So in order to use arrays, there's a few different ways you can do it. You can repeat the action over every item in the array. So if I just want to send an email to each person, I can say, hey, I'm going to send an email to Jane, then an email to Bob, then an email to Dave. Or you can try to combine all of those list items together into a single email. Or you can just grab one item from that list. There's a bunch of different ways that you can work with arrays in order to get them to do what you want. And it will vary depending on what your scenario is. The most common way to interact with arrays is by using apply to each. And in apply to each, we will automatically add that container on when you use an output that's part of a list. So if I have an API that I call that lists all the users, say in an Office 365 group, and that returns back the user's emails, their names, their IDs, and I try to use the email address of that user in a send email step, bam, it's going to put the apply to each around that send email action, which means you'll get a bunch of emails that get sent out. So this may be what you want. Maybe you want an email for each user in the group. However, in some cases, it's not what you want. And you can manipulate this by grabbing a certain item from the list or by converting the whole list to a string. So how do you get certain items out of a list? So I have a list, say, of users, and I want to be able to get just the first user. Maybe I know that I did a search, and the most relevant item is at the top, and I just want to grab that one. So we have a first expression that you can use. You can just go to first and say, hey, grab that first item. We also have a last expression. Additionally, you can also use the square brackets to pick a specific item out of an array. So this is how it works in many other programming languages as well. And the other thing to keep in mind is this item starts at 0. So the first item is index 0, the third item is index 2, et cetera. So that off by one thing, depending on your philosophy for language, can vary a little bit, but that's how it works inside Microsoft Flow. And then for objects inside arrays, you will, of course, need to get the specific property you're interested in from that object when you choose it. So if I'm looking at users, I want to get, say, the user's email. I need to put that square bracket email after the end of the expression to grab that particular property. Now, another thing you could do is you can convert that list to a string. So let's say that I have a list of email addresses, and I want to get one string that I can use inside of a flow to send an email. In that case, I can use the join card. The join action allows me to put a simple delimiter in, like a semicolon or a comma or something like that. And then all of those emails we put as a single object that can be used elsewhere in the flow. Now, if you have an array of objects, however, you can't just combine them together willy-nilly with a string or a comma. So instead, what you can do with those is you can actually convert an array of objects to an HTML table. So imagine that I go and I get back a list of users from a group, and I want to be able to send an email saying, here are the users in your group. You can actually do that with a single action called create HTML table that goes and gets that item, converts the whole list into a simple, beautiful table inside HTML, and sends that email. Now, with arrays, another thing you may need to be able to do is to filter them. And for filtering, one important caveat I would like to mention is ideally you can use filtering inside of the backing service. So if I'm going to SharePoint and I'm getting a list of rows from a SharePoint list, I might want to use only a certain set of rows from that list. Maybe I don't need all of the rows. I only need 2 or 3 rows. In that case, I should use the filter query input on the SharePoint action to be able to get that filter passed to the SharePoint connector, and it will only return back those 3 rows. Because there are limits on the number of rows that different types of connectors can return. And that limit actually varies from connector to connector. So if you do have a very large list, for example, you may want to pass that filter directly to the backing service. Now, unfortunately, the syntax that this action uses is something called OData. And if you've been with Microsoft for a very long time, you probably have heard of OData before. You probably don't like it very much. So with OData, we do have a lot of documentation on how to get this to work for yourself. So you can go and check that out if you want. But I don't necessarily expect most users to figure this out. So in that case, we have a built-in flow action that can do filtering using a friendly condition builder that we built inside of Flow. But remember that caveat that if that connector returns back more items than can be fit, then you may be missing items when you actually do the filter inside of the flow itself. Now, the filter action looks and feels just like a condition and even has the edit in advance mode, just like conditions do. So you can click that, and then you can go and you can use ands and ors and nots and all those same Boolean expressions I was talking about earlier in order to get the filter down to exactly what you want. There's also expressions for taking some number of items from the beginning or from the end of the list. Now, when you have an array of items, say I have an array of those users again, I have something like a display name and email, there are other actions inside Flow that can take arrays as inputs. So if I want to be able to pass that array of one shape of users, where they have properties like display name and mail, and I want to pass that to an action that has a different shape, let's say they call those properties name and email instead of display name and mail. In that case, you can use an action that we have called select. And that allows you to effectively rename the columns of a table, to rename the properties of objects. So you can use that to convert arrays from one form to another. And there's actually, on the select card, there's two different modes. I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's this weird little toggle at the right-hand side of this card. And what that does is that allows you to toggle between entering key value pairs, which will convert an array of objects to another array of objects, or between typing directly in, which allows you to convert from an array of objects to an array of strings or numbers or whatever property you want. So in some cases, for example, in the send email action, you just want a list of email addresses. You want to get just that one property and combine it together. So in that case, what you'll do is you will hit that little toggle and choose just the email property. Now, once you have an array, you want to be able to pass that in to the following step. So in this case, that toggle shows up again when you are providing data into an action. And if you have key value pairs that you want to just type directly into the action, you can do that. This is the default way that array inputs work, and that they've worked for quite some time. So if I want to hard code, for example, in this action where I'm sending an email, and emails have a list of attachments that can be attached to them. And I want to be able to say, hey, here's the first attachment, and its name is X, and its content comes from, say, a file uploaded to Dropbox. You can just hard code those as key value pairs, and off you go. It will work. However, if you get a list of attachments from another place, and you want to be able to use all of those attachments in the send email action, at that point you need to hit that toggle, and you need to pass in an array that has the appropriate format of that particular action. So you need to do some transformation, and I'll show you exactly how that works. So once you have an array, you may want to do some other operations on it. So arrays support things like union or intersect to be able to do math on an array to see if there are duplicate items. You can do containment on an array, so you can say, hey, does this array contain this object? A bunch of different things you can do with that. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I jump back into the demos is you may need to build objects directly. So typically, you get a pretty nice experience for just using outputs from other actions. But we have an action called compose. And compose allows you to input an array directly or a JSON object directly. And those key value pairs can be a way that you can build up objects that you use elsewhere in a flow. Likewise, if you are, say, making a call to an HTTP endpoint, you can do that using a compose card or with the typing the JSON objects as well. And the syntax for creating objects is the curly brace and then the key value pairs separated by commas. One final thing to keep in mind for when you're building objects is there are some characters that you can't use in certain places. So if you recall, the single quote character was used for making something be a string in an expression, right? But what happens if that string already has a single quote character in it? Well, you need to escape that character. And the way you do that is by typing the single quote character twice, which is different from a double quote character, even though it can look very similar. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at something and you miss it. So you have that. Now, inside action names, we actually convert the spaces to underscores. That's another thing to keep in mind. And finally, when you are building an object, you need to escape the @ character at the beginning. And the reason for that is, if you recall from building a condition, in the condition, the @ sign means that the rest of the statement is an expression. So if I didn't put @ in front of the odata.type field, it would try to find an expression called odata, and we don't have one, and then the flow would fail. So that is something else to keep in mind. So I can, I have to enter my password again. OK. So let's come back to this demo. So if we recall, we were last here. And so let's see real quick if we can get this fixed. So I copied this. it's not updating. There we go. OK, so what we're going to do is the first thing, if you recall, we had email aliases here that could be separated by commas. So what we want to do is we want to take those comma-separated items, and we want to split them up, and then we want to add, say, @Microsoft.com to each of those things. So I'm going to do it underneath the delay because it's only once I'm ready to send the email out. And I can use the select action to operate on top of that array. So I'll do that under data operations, and I'll find select. And now the array that I'm going to pass in to select is going to be built from an expression. I actually want to split the aliases field on the comma. So this converts the string to an array that I can then manipulate. So in this case, I can pass in the aliases. And the character that I want to split it on is just the single comma. So this will return back an array of email aliases. And then if I wanted to generate objects, I could do that here using the key and the value. Instead, I want to generate just a list of simple strings. So what I will do here is I will use an expression to concatenate. So this is concatenating strings together, the item, which is the item that the array is operating over, and @Microsoft.com. So now this should return back a list of email addresses for people at Microsoft.com. So I can come back into the send an email action, and I can, in the CC field, I want to CC all of the owners. So I need to join that array back together. You can use an action for this, but you can also type it in directly. I'm going to join the outputs from select, and I'm going to join it with a semicolon, because for whatever reason, Outlook wants to use semicolons instead of commas. So I can put that in. So now I have a list of emails added to this. Now, the other thing that I want to do is I want to add in the attachments to these list items onto the email itself. And email attachments, if you noticed, that is an array. And you can also have an array of attachments on a SharePoint list item. You can have as many attachments as you want. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to transform that array from one shape to another shape. So I'll come in here and I'll say get attachments. That will give me the actions for SharePoint, so I'll get attachments. This actually is named a little poorly. It probably should be called list attachments because it doesn't actually return back the content of the attachment. Instead, I will have to add another action to retrieve that. So I'll come in here and add the get attachment content action. And for this action, I'm, of course, using the same list and SharePoint site that I've been using for the entire demo. And the same item. Notice how because we filtered down that list, again, it's very easy to select the right thing, and ID. OK, bam. So that was the apply to each. That was added because get attachments returns back a list of attachments, obviously. And I need to get the attachment content for each of those attachments. With get attachment content, I now need to transform this to something that the send an email step expects. So I can use the compose action to create an object. So I select compose. And now this is where I can start typing JSON objects. So the email attachments has two properties. It has a name. And here I can just use the display name for that attachment. And it has content bytes. Now, this is important because the data that's returned back from the get attachment content operation, this is encoded in binary. The data that's encoded in the email is encoded in base 64. So if you tried to pass it directly, this step would actually fail because the encoding is different. If you remember from that giant table, I actually have to add an expression here to convert from one encoding to another encoding, because I'm down here and I'm composing my own thing. If I had just flowed these properties directly and it had just worked, I may not have to do that. But in this case, because I'm constructing an array from scratch, I have to do it explicitly. So I can come here and say base 64. That's the expression that can convert these two types. And then I can select the attachment content. Oh, need a quote around that. And there we go. So now I have built, because it's inside a apply to each, it is an array of objects that have name and content bytes. And that is the exact format that this action takes. So here I can simply just drop in the outputs of the compose action. And I'll update this flow. And maybe this time this one will work. We'll see. So I'll come in and I will add a new list item. So let's say this is the Ignite party prep. And I'll select an end time. I think the party is tomorrow. OK, thanks. Party is tomorrow. And I'll put a couple email addresses here. And I will add some cool logos that Microsoft has that we want to use at the party. And I will hit save. And I'll come back here. Yes, this action didn't work because, so I'm actually going to try to get it to work this time. We'll see how long this takes. So this is the ticks function expects a string, but the provided type was null. And that's because I didn't coalesce the optional field. So I will, so it wasn't here, it was this one. And I will coalesce. And UTC, oops, UTC now. And did it close my parentheses? Oh. I think, sorry, what was that? It is after the, yeah. OK, so I will cheat again and come back to my little cheat sheet. Unfortunately, the expression editor, I guess, is a little small inside of the text box when I zoom in all the way. On a bigger monitor, it's a little easier to use. So I have this. Ticks. I'll give it one more try, and if this doesn't work, I will go directly to the completed solution. Now with Flow, if you've used Flow before, you may recall there is the ability to resubmit. So I don't have to go back to the SharePoint list and add the action back in. I actually can just resubmit it, and it works. So a little live debugging there. So yes. And now if I come back here, you can see that I got an email. Also notice that the people whose aliases I had comma separated are CC'd on that email. So it successfully processed that list of emails, converted them to Microsoft emails. It also processed the attachments, put them onto the email, and also notice that this is in local time, not in the time of UTC. So a bunch of different things happened in this, this flow. Hopefully you found it interesting, and I finally figured it out, I guess. Thank you to Pratap. There we go. OK, so next, I will talk about control flow and action settings. So with control flow, the way that a flow normally works is it runs all of its steps in sequence. That means that the first step is followed by the second step, and if the second step fails, the third step will not run. So a flow terminates once it hits an error. Now, there's an additional status on flow actions called skipped. And that means that the previous actions did not run. So between the failure, the fact that action can just time out, it can never respond, and skipped, there are actually 4 possible states for an action. So succeeded, failed, timed out, and skipped. Now, that's important in just a moment, which I will go through the error handling section. But first, if you've used Flow, you may notice there's that ... menu. It doesn't even have a formal name. We just always call it the ... menu. It shows up at the top right of all of the actions and triggers. And you can go there and you can get some interesting things. So there's 2 particularly advanced things. You can go there, you can do settings, and you can configure run after. Inside of settings, we have features like being able to configure the asynchronous behavior. So that's when a flow goes to an action and waits for a response. You can configure the timeout, so how long the flow will wait before it proceeds. Retry policy for transient errors, whether or not an action is sequential or in parallel, et cetera. So with error handling, you go to that configure run after option, and you can select when an action should run based on the status of its predecessors. So in this case, in the example right here, I'm running this action only when the previous step fails. You can use this for remediation steps in your flow. If something went wrong with your flow and you want to be able to send a notification to the person who created the flow, you can use error handling steps for that. You can also configure the retry policy, which is meant more for transient errors, for temporary errors, because we'll retry a few times, but if there's kind of a persistent error in the flow, like in the flow that I built earlier would never have run, even with the retry policy, because I had mistyped that expression. So retry policy wouldn't have helped there. But if you have a service and it goes down for a few minutes, that's where retry policy comes in. So sometimes you need error handling steps, sometimes you can use a retry policy. Now, in addition to running in sequence, actions can run in parallel as well. So you can easily add a parallel branch to any flow by selecting the Add Parallel Branch option above an action. And that will stick another action just to the right of that previous one. So you can see here the example in the screenshot. And inside of 4H, you can also configure whether or not actions run in parallel or in sequence. One of the most common questions that I get is, when is Flow going to add looping support? And the answer is we actually already have it. It just doesn't necessarily operate the way that a lot of people would think from a classical workflow approach. So inside Flow, you can't simply say, I want, after this action executes, to jump back to some other action. That isn't possible to model inside of Flow. Instead, we use something called do until, which means we always evaluate a condition to return back to a previous step. So that allows us to ensure in a slightly better way that you don't have infinite loops. Now, sure, you could create a condition in there that always returns back true or false, and then your flow will still loop for, it's not quite infinite. There's throttles in place that you can configure, but it will loop for a very long time. In this case, though, this is an approval flow. And on Friday at 9 a.m., I very much hope nobody is leaving after the party on Thursday, because Marwan has a session where he's going to be going through a number of different approval scenarios, including a multi-level approval and an approval that uses looping. So please come check out that session on Friday. So I won't dive into that too much today, but definitely you can convert something like this into something like this, where it's a do until container, and that loops over the content inside it. Now with control flow, because if you imagine you have all these loops and conditionals and all these things going on, and you want to be able to just keep track of some state, you want to be able to increment a counter or set a flag to true or false, you can do that using variables. Now variables inside flow, you make sure that you always initialize them to something, so you need to set their type and what their initial value is, and then you can increment them, you can set them, you can change them however you want. So it's useful for those more complicated flows. There's another action where you can actually terminate a flow in the middle. If you have, again, some very nested logic inside of many ifs, and you want to be able to just escape the flow. You say, this flow is done when this thing happens. You can use something called the terminate action. So you put that in, and you can see this flow on the left is much more hard, much more difficult to read than the flow on the right. And that's because, although it's doing the same thing, on the right, we terminate after each condition. So we escape the flow rather than having all these nested pieces. Then we have the asynchronous actions. Asynchronous actions can be in the middle of a flow, and they can wait for some event to happen. So typically, the flows that I showed earlier, those flows, they just kind of run, and then they're done, right? But in reality, you can have a step in the middle of a flow that you want to wait for some event. So the most common thing for this is approvals, where I want to wait for somebody to approve an expense report. I want to wait for somebody to approve something. But you can also do it with things like waiting for a new email to arrive, waiting for a new item to be updated in a SharePoint list, waiting for a file. Any type of trigger can actually be used in the middle of a flow. But do keep in mind, in those cases, you will want to configure a timeout. So I will switch back to the demo and show just one piece of that control flow. I'm going to add some error handling into this. So with this, at the bottom, I'm just going to add a generic error handling step. And for the error handling step, I'm just going to send myself an email letting me know that, hey, this flow isn't working quite as expected. So I'll send an email, and I will send it to myself. By now, everybody in the world probably knows my email address. Flow is broken. And I come to this ... menu, and I can open the configure run after. So when I configure run after, I get those states that I was talking about earlier with is successful, has failed, has skipped, has timed out. So instead of running this email when the send email succeeded, instead I'm going to run it when either the step failed or it timed out. And that's how I can get that case. So I'll go ahead and update this flow. And there was actually one case that I did not protect against inside of this flow. So if I, final item, if I go and I update this, and I put a bunch of empty email addresses here, these are not valid aliases, and I'm not doing any checks to make sure that the aliases are valid. So when I save this item, the flow will normally would actually fail. It would just completely fail. It would not be able to do anything. So it comes to the end there. You see the send email action failed. And it says, if we look at the outputs, one or more recipients are invalid. So that's too bad. But I added a remediation step. I said, hey, send an email to me letting me know my flow is broken. So if I come back here, you can see that indeed I got an email that ran. The email step ran only after the failure of the previous step. So you can do this anywhere in a flow. You can add an error handling step, and that's how you can make sure that you could take that, you could log it to a logging system. You could go and do other steps. I could do any number of things, any types of actions when an action above it fails. In reality, to make this flow work, what I probably should do is I should add another step that actually validates each of the email addresses to make sure they're valid before the flow runs. But in the interest of time, I will not do that today. You could use a filter to make sure that those email addresses are valid. But we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to move on back to the slides. So finally, I want to talk about working with other workflows. So there's two meanings here. The first is, inside of flow, you can actually call other flows. So you can have this parent-child relationship. The way that you do that is by using what is called the request-response pattern. So normally, a flow is triggered whenever some action happens in the cloud or manually or the schedule, all those things I talked about. But you can also have a flow that's triggered via an incoming request from an HTTP endpoint. And if you build such a flow, you can then use an HTTP card inside of a parent flow to call that child flow. And you may want to do that particularly where you have a bunch of complex steps that you want to reuse inside multiple places inside the same flow or across multiple flows. So that's a very easy way to kind of encapsulate your logic. One thing to note here is because of the request-response pattern being kind of a low-level thing, the user experience is such that you have to type a JSON object to go and call that other workflow. So kind of like I showed on the compose card with the curly brackets and the key value pairs, you need to do the same thing here for child and parent workflows. We do hope to improve this experience in the future. Now, the other meaning I meant for working with other workflows is you can actually convert a flow into a logic app. So for every flow, there's a menu at the top, and you can select Logic App Template. And that goes and that just downloads a JSON file that contains a Logic App definition. And then you can import that into the Azure portal. So you can also email those files back and forth if you want to be able to take that and share your flow with your IT department. You can do it that way. Of course, Flow does have regular co-authoring that you can use as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind with importing from Logic Apps is you need to be able to repair your connections inside of Logic Apps, because although the connectors are the same between Logic Apps and Flow, the connections, so the actual credentials for Flow, are stored inside the Flow service, whereas for Logic Apps, they're stored in your Azure subscription, which means when you import a Flow into Azure Logic Apps, you need to be sure to reconnect any connections that you need inside that flow. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And you only need to do that if you're creating new connections. You can also point an imported flow at an existing Logic Apps connection. But the key is you need to have any of the connections inside your Azure subscription to be able to use them from Logic Apps. And one other thing, you can actually flip it around and call Azure resources from inside of Microsoft Flow. So for both Azure Logic Apps as well as Azure Functions, there's a button at the top called Export. And when you click that button, it will take that flow, that Logic App or that function, and export it in a way that you can use it as a custom connector inside of Flow, which means if you are a developer or an IT person and you're developing this reusable logic in Azure Functions or in Logic Apps, and you want to be able to leverage that or you want everybody in your organization to be able to leverage that, you can do that with one click right from the Azure portal. So I will accelerate this demo just a little bit because we're running short on time. But basically what I've done here is I took this flow that I had, and I'll show you the entry point for it. We have export to Logic Apps. That just saves a JSON file here. Then I went over to the Azure portal and I imported it. So I won't wait for that import to complete. But I just went to New, and then there's Template Deployment down here. I can select the template that I just uploaded, and then I get a Logic App that I just created. You can see this was earlier today, and this is what that same flow imported into Azure looks like. And you see this is the exact same steps that we were just looking at earlier from the flow that I constructed. So all I had to do to get this to work was just connect the connections inside of the Logic Apps Designer inside the Azure portal, and then the flow was able, or the Logic App was able to run and do the same exact things that you could do inside of Flow, but now inside of Logic Apps, I get access to things like the code view, so I can see the underlying code behind this Logic App. I could take this and I could check it into source control. I could use Azure Resource Manager to deploy it. So we get all of the awesome Azure capabilities right from inside of the Azure portal for Microsoft flows that you export. So just wrapping up, we have a lot of different features that we've released in the past 6 months. So some of these things that I've shown, like IntelliSense, those are in the past quarter. And coming up, we have many more new rich features coming. There's things particularly around lifecycle management that we're excited about coming next year to be able to get so that way you can create sandboxes and really work across different environments, as well as being able to publish flows to AppSource. So that's all coming up. And finally, there's still a couple more breakout sessions that I'd recommend. Anjali's session in the morning has already happened, but at this point, definitely go check out the SharePoint Designer comparison, as well as we have a full deep dive into building connectors later this afternoon. There's also a session on application lifecycle management and administration, which I believe is right after this one. So definitely check out those sessions as well if you're interested in the topic. And I think that is, oh, one other thing. There's a community meetup tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. That's the session code. So it's kind of informal. I'm sure there will be a bunch of people there. The entire Flow and Power Apps team is attending. So come meet us. You can talk to us in a more informal session. And with that, I think just the session evaluation. I guess I don't get a giant QR code. Yeah, thank you very much.